Welcome to Deepfakery, a new web series of critical conversations exploring art, human rights journalism, and deepfakes, all in a time of infodemics. I'm Kat Cizek, Artistic Director of the Co-Creation Studio at MIT Open Documentary Lab. This series is a joint presentation between us and Witness, and this series is supported by Knight Foundation, BuzzFeed, and Vimeo. We've come together to examine, from our many different perspectives, deepfake technologies, their uses and misuses in art, journalism, and documentary. We need your mic, Sam.
At least it was me doing that. Hi, I'm Sam Gregory, Program Director at Witness. For those new to Witness and to the series, we're a human rights organization that works with people who use video and technology to secure social justice. For those who are not familiar with deepfakes, we're talking about new ways to use artificial intelligence to make it look like someone said or did something they never did by swapping faces, simulating voices, or manipulating scenes. Today's episode is called Still Funny, ? Satire, Deepfakes, and Human Rights Globally, and I'll be moderating the conversation. Our panelists will talk for about 30 minutes, and we'll have time for your questions at the end. So please drop questions in whatever social channel you're in. We'll be checking and collecting your questions from wherever you are. Today, we're here to broaden the conversation about deepfakes to look both globally and through a human rights frame. We're also going to come back to a recurring question in this series about boundary lines as around deepfakes as satire, parody, and truth-telling. And we're going to talk about this in the context of both sophisticated deepfakes, but also what we've been calling shallow fakes, simpler edits or miscontextualizations of videos to falsely claim they're from an incorrect time or place or situation. First, human rights as values. At Witness, we believe strongly that the International Human Rights Framework provides a powerful normative structure for protecting free expression while also making purposeful choices to prevent harm. As platforms and governments try to manage and regulate manipulated media, human rights needs to be at the core. Secondly, any approach to manipulated media must look at this as a global problem, not one where the focus or the prioritization is on the US and Europe. We know from past experience the harms of letting platforms like Facebook neglect the impact of their choices in Myanmar, India, and Brazil just as much as the US. So our conversation here deliberately starts by centering experiences of shallow fakes and deepfakes in Africa. Thirdly, it's never been easy to make judgments about irony, satire, and free expression online, and it's been hard for many years to work out how to distinguish spoof from reality online, particularly when content is unmoored from its original context and or lacks the markers of irony. So that places us in a context of considering how we track and understand deepfakes and other manipulated media. How do we preserve the power of satire and enable people to see satire when it's intended? How do we challenge the gaslighting of viewers when increasingly sophisticated media is passed off as reality or as satire, but is solely or primarily intended to deceive or harm? As we talk, we're in the middle of an escalating use of manipulated media in the US elections campaign, and similar patterns are emerging globally. So to talk about these questions and others, I'm delighted to be joined by three guests. Julia Wano is the Executive Director of Internet Sans Frontières, Internet Without Borders, and among many other distinctions, a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Professor Evelyn Aswad is a professor in international law at the University of Oklahoma and director of its Center for International Business and Human Rights. She's also a member of Facebook's Oversight Board. And my colleague Adebayo Okiowo is a human rights lawyer and Witness's program manager for Africa. He co-led the first regional expert meeting focused on preparing better for deepfakes in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to start off with some focused ideas from each participant, and then we'll open up for a group discussion before taking questions from the audience. And speaking of which, please put your questions in the chat whenever you have them. Our first speaker will be Julie, and to kick off our conversation, we're going to share two examples related to deepfakes and manipulated media from West Africa.
Je suis le proconsul de France au Cameroun, l'ambassadeur de France au Cameroun, Christophe Guillou. Je voudrais dire quelques mots aux Camerounaises et aux Camerounais. À savoir que je suis au Cameroun pour les intérêts de la République française. Je recommence. Je suis au Cameroun uniquement, exclusivement, essentiellement, nécessairement pour les intérêts de la République française. La République française, c'est la puissance de tutelle qui, en fait, a colonisé le Cameroun. Même si on a appelé ça territoire sous tutelle, mes ancêtres ont conquis ce territoire par la force, la ruse et le droit international. Une colonie, ça sert à être exploité.
Si votre bien-être m'importe, notre vivre ensemble me préoccupe tout autant. Car rappelons que la nation gabonaise est une et indivisible. Mes chers compatriotes, Gabonaises, Gabonais, avant toute chose, permettez-moi de vous adresser.
Les soldats ont pensé, dans leur discours, que la personne qui est venue lire le discours...
Le spectacle désolant de ce discours de Nouvel An à la nation est une honte aux yeux du monde pour notre pays qui a perdu sa dignité.
Welcome, Julie. Let's jump in to talk more about these two clips. Very different contexts, these clips, very different impacts. Can you tell us more about the story of these clips? Let's start with the clip of the French ambassador to Cameroon.
Yes, the first clip is a deepfake, definitely, and I think it's quite obvious, of the French ambassador to Cameroon, who is basically telling Cameroonians that he is a representative of the colonial power of France in Cameroon. And he's also suggesting a bit further into the clip that Cameroon is still a colony and that independence never really happened, and that he is in the country to preserve that state of the country. And the second clip is an address that was made by President Ali Bongo of of Gabon. Here I am sharing fake news. No, it's President of Gabon, neighboring country of Cameroon. And it's interesting because at the time this address was made, it was in 2018. So December 2018, the president had just suffered a stroke in Saudi Arabia during a summit. And for 2 or 3 months, he was missing in the area. Nobody knew where he was. And when this clip came out, when this address was made, he had been unseen for 3 months and unheard of for 3 months. And even the government was barely giving information about his state of health. And when this clip appeared on Facebook and on the national TV, very rapidly, people doubted of the veracity of the clip and doubted that it was really the president making that address. So many activists reached out to us, and while it is true that most of the experts err on the side of this not being a deepfake, but nevertheless, at the time, there was a huge doubt, and that doubt has led to the country witnessing its second coup attempt in its whole history. It's in its whole modern history. So yes, 2 different contexts with 2 different impacts, one in which a coup almost led to overthrowing the current regime. So very interesting clips and cases here to discuss.
Julie, let me ask one follow-up on the first clip. What was the impact of that clip? How did people react to it?
So there were 2 reactions, and I think that's why it's interesting to mention this case. On the one hand, Cameroonian citizens knew it wasn't a real video, it wasn't a real clip, because first of all, the person who shared it, he's a professor in France, a Cameroonian activist and professor who is very opposed to the current Cameroonian regime. And he's campaigning along with opposition parties in the country. So he shared it on Facebook and on YouTube saying, this is a deep fake. People, look, this is a deep fake of the French ambassador telling us the truth about Cameroon. And it was perceived that way. But through a partnership between Facebook and the Observers being a program of France 24 being the French international media. So through a fact-checking program and partnership between Facebook and the Observers have, labeled this clip as partially false. And I think it's interesting because it's first of all, we don't really know what's partially false. There is a huge discussion on, the relationship that exists between France and its former colonial empire, and many of these discussions are erring on the side of there's never been an independence, and a lot of people believe that, and a lot of historians believe that because of certain, agreements that still exist between the different countries. This, on the one hand, we don't know what was labeled actually partially false. And on the other hand, it's difficult because a satire is obviously false. So do you really have to say that it's false, or do you have to call it, the way it is, which is a satire? Because what we discussed at Untitled Chapter when we were sent this case was, if you label it false, then it's purely, it has consequences. And whoever shares this clip will be labeled as someone sharing fake news. And we know how Facebook treats fake news at the moment, Facebook and other social media. So we thought it was important to have this debate because it questions to the extent to which, by fighting fake news, platforms actually contribute in silencing important debates and and expression in countries that desperately need those debates and expression. And it's even to the point that the ambassador himself tweeted the article written by the Observer's, France 24's Observers, in which the clip was labeled as partially false. He tweeted the fact checking as, well, this clip is fake news, don't share it. So for us, it was important to question this, because it shows the extent to which the decisions made by platforms is impacting democracy and debate in countries, and specifically the fight against fake news. And on the case of President Ali Bongo, it was interesting to mention it as well, because for us at the time, it was obvious. Platforms should have done something about this, should have at least said there is a debate about this. And I even think that doing so, this case was 2 years ago, doing so would have helped platforms deal with the amount of manipulative media that we have now. If the platform, and even Twitter, I'm talking about Facebook because it was aired on Facebook Live, if it had been taken very seriously from the beginning, not waiting 1 or 2 years like we've seen, well, it would have helped Facebook's policy teams and disinformation teams to nurture discussions on what if it happens here during the US elections 2 years from now. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And we're seeing that platforms are more or less, I wouldn't say unprepared, but they're making decisions that can be questionable. So yeah.
Thank you, Julie. Those two clips are such a good introduction to so many of the themes we're talking about. So I'd like to turn over now to Bayo to talk a little bit about some of the trends and concerns you see from your work around shallow fakes and deep fakes more broadly in Africa. It's good to see you, Bayo. So last year in November, you co-organized an expert convening in South Africa that brought together journalists, activists, civic movement leaders, and other experts to talk about how to prepare better for deepfakes on the continent. So there's more information from that convening and similar ones in Witness that Witness has hosted globally at the link on the screen. And Bayo, can I turn to you to talk about some of the key trends you're seeing on the African continent in this area?
Hi, Sam. It's good to see you as well. And thanks to everybody who has joined us for this session. Yes, like you did mention, we had a workshop in South Africa last year, which brought together activists, journalists, and other stakeholders in this space. And we had that in partnership with human rights, and a conversation as part of decentering this whole issue from just it being focused on the US and Europe, and start to think about how it impacts on Africans in Africa as a whole. And one of the we had several findings from that workshop. I think I'll just highlight 3 because it's impossible to go through all of it. I would recommend that you kindly go check out some of the reports we put out on this issue subsequently. But some of the key findings we got from that workshop include, for instance, there isn't yet a prevalence of deep fakes on the continent. Rather, what we have more often are shallow fakes, even though that's like a young to deep fakes. So we need media literacy, because if we engage in a lot of media literacy on how communities and general populace can identify shallow fakes, it sets the stage for reality of deep fakes becoming more rampant. And so we felt that was a key finding from that workshop. Media literacy kept coming up over and over again, because not a lot of people still know how to quickly identify or spot a shallow fake. And of course, that is very, very prevalent on the continent: miscontextualization, sharing of stuff that was not relevant to some of the issues, and it would have gone viral before it stopped in its track, and it would have led to a lot of misinformation as a result. And the second thing that I would highlight from our findings during that workshop is that there isn't enough capacity on the side of journalists. So the tools for spotting and countering deep fakes at the moment is quite a luxury, and we need to then be able to empower more journalists and media houses on the continent to know how to apply the relevant tools to spot these deep fakes and train them appropriately, because they are at the forefront. At the moment, some of the journalists themselves are grappling with how to identify these deep fakes, and we've seen instances on the continent where things have been shared and they have resorted to be inappropriate, inaccurate. And while we've seen some accountability on the side of some of these individuals and groups. Not a lot of people have been held accountable as well, and that has led to a lot of problems around misinformation. And thirdly, I would highlight would be that platforms themselves need to pay more attention to places outside of the US and Europe, because it's already evident even in the way you see that companies like Twitter do not have any base, any regional office in Africa. And Facebook only has a very minimum, very, very little team in parts of Africa. That already signals the fact that they haven't prioritized it yet. And the problem with that is when you start to have issues of deepfakes or shallow fakes emerge out of the continent, the local context will be lost. You can't have people sitting in Washington or in Paris trying to decide whether something that has emerged from the continent is a shallow fake or a deepfake, which will lack in the local context. The language will be lost. So there needs to be some investment on the part and commitment from the part of Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms towards countering this issue, but also engaging with local activists and journalists and all of that. And in the bid to make sure we push back against shallow fakes and deepfakes, we also must ensure that we are not getting to a space of deleting everything that appears to be deepfake or shallow fake, because we run the risk also of taking off the internet some very key evidence of human rights violations, which is also a space that Witness is very, very particular about.
Thank you, Bayo, and we'll come back to some of those questions about the threats from deepfakes on the continent, hopefully later in the conversation. So I'd like to turn now to Evelyn to talk about how we can use the human rights framework to think about these manipulated media. As Julia's highlighted, this is complicated. We don't want to suppress or dismiss legitimate speech, and we need to be very attentive to the real-world consequences of both manipulated media and the suspicion of manipulation, as in the case of the president of Gabon. Can you walk us through how to think about this?
Yes, sure. And thank you, Sam, for having me on this program. So I think it is very important, as Witness is saying, to take a human rights approach to these very complex questions. And under international human rights law standards, we start with a presumption very heavily in favor of broad protections for speech, the transmission of ideas, receiving them, ideas of any kind over borders through any media. Now, international human rights standards do allow for limiting speech or burdening speech, but the speech regulator must meet a three-part test. And this is a one strike and you're out test. All three tests must be met. And they're known as the legality, legitimacy, and necessity tests. So under the legality test, any attempt to regulate speech must not, among other things, be vague or overly broad. So if we start seeing legislation to deal with deep fakes or manipulated media, we need to be very attentive that they are very particular in giving notice of what is being limited and in not being overly broad in doing so. This prong also has some due process protections built into it. The second test is legitimacy. And that means the purpose for limiting the speech must be a legitimate public interest objective, such as public health or national security. Now, if a deepfake legislation were just to be a pretext to protect an existing government or regime or head of state, that would not be acceptable. But there are legitimate public interest reasons that are triggered in the deepfake scenarios that we've been talking about that could pass this test. Now, the third test, necessity, I think is where it would be very important to have a very interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approach to assessing when is it necessary to limit speech. And here we have a three-part human rights due diligence test that needs to be assessed. So the first part of determining if something is the least intrusive means is, or the least intrusive burden on speech, is it really necessary to limit the speech to achieve the legitimate public interest objective? So in the deepfake context, questions we might ask ourselves here are governments or platforms investing enough in digital literacy and media literacy? Another question we might ask are governments and platforms investing in technologies that would empower consumers to be able to realize when they are looking at a deep fake or a manipulated, other type of manipulated media. If we assess those options and we still come to the conclusion that the legitimate public interest is still not served, then we go to the second step, which would mean looking at a continuum of options that burden on speech and then choosing the least burdensome one. So for example, on that spectrum, and again, this would take a multi-stakeholder approach to brainstorming. On one end, you might have a requirement for some kind of marking so that people know they're looking at manipulated media, even if it's shared, even if it was originally in a context where it was obvious, it might be shared in a context where it wasn't obvious. And you look at a variety of other options in terms of the reach of such content, the platforms amplifying it, et cetera, all the way to the end of the spectrum, banning something or banning a user from a platform. So that would be your continuum. And you have that conversation of what's the least intrusive means to achieve your legitimate purpose. And then the third part is monitoring if the burden on speech is working, or is it counterproductive? If it's not, it cannot be upheld under international human rights standards. You are banning speech without achieving a legitimate objective. And I would just make one final note here that these standards, international human rights law standards, were taken from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19, and really apply to state actors. But thanks to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the international community has called on businesses, including platforms, to respect these same standards in their content moderation. And because a lot of the platforms are based in the United States, I would just mention that the United States has on numerous occasions called on all American companies to treat the UN guiding principles on business and human rights as a minimum standard in their operations.
Thank you, Evelyn. That was a tremendous explanation of the framework very quickly as well. I think often people are afraid of human rights because they assume it's going to be incredibly complex or esoteric. And I think just for those watching, there's a very clear way to think through this. Now, obviously, we have to place that in a discussion, a multi-stakeholder discussion to do it right. Thank you for that excellent grounding in the realities and the frameworks. I'd like to open us up for a discussion. Let me remind viewers to please add your questions into the comments or whatever platform you're watching, and we'll come to them shortly. And glad to have Julie and Adebayo back joining us. I think there are so many directions we could go on questions. I think maybe I just want to pick up straight away kind of one question that's obviously hanging in the air here, which is around what should platforms do? And I think, we're seeing at the moment an escalation of a range of these manipulated media. There are more of them. They're being deployed more frequently. So maybe just to start, and this could be a first step, what should platforms do in this space to respond to this, bearing in mind the human rights framework, bearing in mind the context that, Julie, that you and Adebayo have shared? And maybe if I can just go to each person just for a short answer there, and I'll start with Julie.
Yes, thank you, Sam, and thanks so much to Adebayo and Evelyn. This was really fantastic. I will speak for what should platforms do regarding context, and I will, follow up on Evelyn's multi-stakeholder approach. That's so essential. We know that, for instance, before launching their products, most of the platforms don't always conduct human rights impact assessment, so studies assessment, which would help them to know in advance proactively whether or not their products in the way they are deployed would have negative impacts on societies. But to do that, you need to hear from the people who will use your platform. And these people are represented by different civil society organizations, digital rights organization, of course, but beyond that, women's rights organization, consumer organization, there's so many. So I think it's important for platforms to have this channel of communication and direct connection to these groups, because not doing so will always lead us to reacting to problems instead of imagining that the problems could happen and finding solutions to them. So I'm really pushing a lot for more channels of communication between platform team, platforms teams and civil society organization. And even beyond the launch, once the product is out there, how do you make sure on a daily basis that, you know, the way the tool is used, it's not weaponized or it's not misused by bad actors? So to do that, you still need to communicate very often with civil society organizations, and even to some extent embed some of them in the work that you do. At Untitled Chapter, for instance, on another subject which is related to hate speech, we have been offering to platform to work with a network of organizations that we have trained on the issue of hate speech using methodologies that exist out there in international human rights law. And this network is so valuable because it is, on the one hand, trained on issues around hate speech, sometimes even better than certain platforms, to be honest. But beyond that, they also know very well how what's buzzing, like to use a buzzword, and also what's making the headlines and what could go wrong. So I think this very acute knowledge and expertise should be harnessed more by platforms, and so that we can go a bit away from that dialogue between governments and companies, because we know how that ends, and it usually ends against freedom of expression.
Thank you, Julie. Can I go to Bio, to you, for one thing you'd like to see the platforms doing in this area?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Julie has said, but if I were to add on to that, it would be to say there should be a lot of transparency and sincerity from the part of the platforms themselves. We know that Facebook, Twitter are taking steps towards being more accountable about these issues, and for instance, they're developing policies around these issues. But again, we do not want it to be just for for the sake of it, because people have asked for these things to be done. Let there be sincerity and transparency, and let them not avoid taking accountability and responsibility for some of these issues, because they have set up committees, some boards, oversight boards, and things like that. At the end of the day, the platforms must still take responsibility, and because they have involved some civil society groups and stakeholders isn't the excuse for them to deflect away from the responsibility. Ultimately, that is that of the platforms themselves. And of course, being African, please involve Africa in these conversations. Don't let it be an afterthought. Let it be front and center, because the issues just as well impact on Africa as much as it does in the global north.
Thank you, Bio. And Evelyn, is there anything you would encourage as an immediate first step in this area of platforms?
Yes, thank you. Just building a little bit on what Julie was mentioning, their lack of human rights impact assessments. Not only should they be conducting them with a global multi-stakeholder input, but they should be releasing them. We should be seeing them for each change to their platform content rules, including with regard to deepfakes and manipulated media. And I hope that, going forward, civil society will be very demanding when they issue these changes in asking to see the human rights impact assessment. At this point, the UN Guiding Principles have been adopted since 2011, so we're almost coming on their 10-year anniversary. And those principles call for those human rights impact assessments to be undertaken and released. So we should be expecting more from the platforms at this point.
Thank you all. I'm going to take a few more questions and address them maybe to specific people, but I encourage anyone else to jump in. Just let me know if you want to weigh in on a question. Bio, let me ask about a question of kind of extreme views and polarization, and kind of our expectations of the other. Like, we live in very polarized societies. And there's an internet law called Poe's law that is like one of those kind of, it's not a law, of course, it's one of those things people say on the internet. And Poe's law goes something like that: any online parody of an extreme viewpoint is indistinguishable from the reality of that extreme viewpoint, right? So it's very hard to comment on extreme views without it being very similar to extreme views. And we've also heard a lot about people who share miscontextualized media saying, look, I know this isn't exactly what it is, but it represents something very close to an underlying reality of something I face or of what I perceive in my political opponents. And I know you've been thinking about that and looking at some of those comparative examples. And I wonder if you could talk about that, and maybe the Burna Boy example from Nigeria and South Africa.
Absolutely, Sam. So yes, I think let me just start off by giving the Burna Boy example and then make a bit of an explanation around your question. So for those who don't know, I'll be surprised if you do not know actually Burna Boy. That means you're not listening to Nigerian music at all. But Burna Boy is one of the very foremost Nigerian artists, music artists. In fact, he dubs himself as the African giant. So he's been, of course, very outspoken about human rights and making sure that people do not get oppressed on the continent, that governments do the right thing. And so, being Nigerian, he spoke out about the xenophobic attacks in South Africa last year against foreigners, including Nigerians. And in his very passionate outburst, he did share some videos which were of xenophobic attacks against foreigners, but which were from a previous time. And for that reason, a number of South Africans were very upset because already people felt that the issue of xenophobia was being blown out of proportion and that he was adding fuel to the fire by sharing some video from a previous era. So when he was called out on that, he eventually deleted the post, but maintained that nonetheless, xenophobic attacks are going on in South Africa. And so his point remains valid that South Africans and South African government need to do something specific about the attacks against foreigners. And so that goes to the point of when people do think that, well, even though what I shared is misinformation or miscontextualization, it doesn't take away from the fact that that is the reality on the ground. But we must be very wary of that because we can't in any way encourage any miscontextualization. It diminishes our reliability and the truth of our own story. I think that every individual, activist, group must take responsibility for sharing authentic information so that it does not give the oppressive governments also a reason to undermine our truth, because that is what they will continue to go to as an excuse and say, oh, but you shared this misinformation the other time. How can we trust that what you're sharing now is authentic? And that would then impact on us being able to pick out the truth of what communities might be facing and which needs urgent attention.
If I could just rapidly on what Bayo was saying, I wholeheartedly agree with the importance of avoiding as much as possible miscontextualization and avoiding as much as possible. Sorry, it's very hard. Avoid as much as possible the sharing of misinformation, because indeed that is used as an excuse by repressive regime who before had difficulty justifying censorship, but now it's very easy for them to do so. They can say, oh, Facebook, Twitter are not doing anything to fight against hate speech and fake news, so I just have no other choice than to block these platforms. And increasingly people agree with that discourse because, of course, they don't want their country to become, a heaven for misinformation, disinformation, and all this negative content that do have consequences offline. So I think it's what Bayo is saying so essential because it goes further. It's just beyond the importance of having the truth. It also goes to the importance of having even access to the information and access to a platform of expression. That's the first thing that I wanted to stress on. And the second thing, when we talk about context, when we think of the fact-checking networks that are being created by platforms at the moment, we can question that as well. I personally find it very interesting that in the case of the Cameroonian deepfake, which is not, it's obviously a deepfake, but it was not made to deceive because the author obviously said it wasn't a real clip. But when you have a French media, funded by the French government, which is asked by Facebook and other platforms to give its opinion on the veracity of that clip, it's interesting, right? So I think it would be interesting as well for platforms to diversify the network of fact checkers, because, and it's not only in the case of the Cameroonian, debate. It goes well beyond even in the US and many other places of the world who are, fact checking the fact checkers. I think that's how we say it. So it's important when we talk about the mechanism to reinstate the truth or reinstate context, to refer to people who know that context as well, and media organizations particularly. So it goes back to what you were saying, Bio, on the importance of training as well, newsrooms in on the continent, which have probably less advanced on certain techniques to identify deepfakes. So yeah, wanted to specify this.
Great. I want to pick up and note that one of the things that Bio and myself and our colleagues at Witness heard when we held the expert convening in South Africa was, the real perception from people of the threat to this sort of fragile ability to show what's wrong with citizen media, and the ability of the state to weaponize the concept of deepfakes to both target activists, but also dismiss activists and dismiss alternative sources of media. So I think we heard that very strongly echoed. I want to put a question out that is coming up around context, and it's picking up actually on something we've been talking about. It's when we come to satire and when we come to content we encounter online, but particularly satire, it's critical that it have markers that show us that it's ironic, right? We look and go, oh, this is clearly satire. And when we look at the Cameroon video, it's clearly satire, right? Like, this is meant to be poking fun, but also making a political point as it does that. And a fundamental problem that we have online is that often contextual information that something is satire is lost when it's shared, right? So when it gets taken from a site. And what we're seeing more and more is we're seeing that weaponized, and we're seeing the public gaslit. So what I mean by that is there are videos that are created on supposed satire sites where there is no intention that they're going to be used and seen on that site. They're going to be reshared, for example, to attack a presidential candidate. So the satire is gaslighting in the sense of the phrase being like, when you say, I don't think, when you challenge it, people say, well, didn't you get that it was funny, right? Didn't you understand that was satire, when clearly it was meant to deceive or harm? So I'm wondering, how do we deal with that phenomenon? Because it's about the way the internet works. It's about how things lose their context. And that seems like a particularly complicated one, Evelyn, for how we apply these tests of human rights and how we apply platform frameworks. So I wonder if anyone wants to weigh in on that. Maybe I'll ask Evelyn if that's something you'd like to think about. Is it something about labeling these more aggressively and retaining that labeling to go to your kind of framework? What are ways we could approach this problem of loss of context, but it's done deliberately?
Yeah, I'll just give some short thoughts and then, of course, turn over to the other panelists. I think something we'd need to ask is, if there were to be a rule that required marking of manipulated media, would the creators of satire feel that has, undermined their initial thrust or moment, And I know on your first part of this series, there was a panelist who works on deep reckonings, and she's very transparent up front that what she's doing is not real, and she doesn't feel it undermines it. She thinks it actually boosts it. So it would be interesting just to engage with creators of satire and parodies and say, if you had to have a marking, would that take away from the impact of your work, or could you still proceed? And if we get some kind of consensus that we can proceed, and that that would be the least intrusive burden on speech, rather than having speech platforms taking down satire because they think people can be misguided or deceived through it. That is something I think to think about. But again, that discussion needs to happen.
Great. We're close to time, so I just want to check, Julie or Bio, if there's a quick comment you'd like to make on that topic.
I would. Sorry. Okay, Julie, go on.
Yes, I think it reminds me of. You remember at the time on Twitter, there was a debate on whether or not you have to make it obvious that it's a parody account. I know there was one for Nicolas Sarkozy, and I can't remember another very prominent figure. So I think, yes, labeling could be interesting to make sure that the public is aware that and is, while sharing, is also making aware other people that this is not the reality. I think it's a matter of good faith, definitely. But I agree with Evelyn. This discussion cannot happen with the people who create this content and how they perceive their art, because it's also a form of art and a form of expression that has to be respected this way. So, yeah.
And I was
Thank
just
you.
going
I'll
to
go to you,
add that,
Bio, for final thought.
yeah, in addition to labeling, I think huge media literacy is important because it might be difficult to monitor every single person who's creating satire that is kind of deep-faked and all of that. But if we increase the level of media literacy across board, that everybody can by themselves verify what is deep-faked or shallow fake and stuff like that, we would be able to pull back the impact, the negative impact on that gradually. I think media literacy might be one of the ways to go as well.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. I think I could talk for hours with you, and I think this is hopefully the start of a conversation that is important to have in this community and beyond. So thanks so much to you, Julie, Adebayo, and Evelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to all of you for this incredible conversation around building new frameworks for human rights, but also perhaps a new kind of punctuation in our visual language as it emerges. You know, we have the quotation mark in text, and what is that going to look like as we signal what we are trying to say? Thank you so much, Evelyn Oswald, Julie Awono, and Bio Okewo. And thank you to all the colleagues behind the scenes at Witness and at MIT. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Knight Foundation, and to BuzzFeed and Vimeo for media support on this series. I'm going to hand it back to Sam. Thank you for that great moderation, and you'll give us a heads up on what's next in the Deepfake series.
Thanks, Kat. The next week's episode happens on Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We'll be continuing our focus on satire, free expression, and human rights globally, with a special edition in collaboration with the Witness Brazil team, featuring Bruno Sartori, Brazil's leading deepfake satirist, who pokes fun at the powerful in Brazil with his compelling deepfakes. Please note that this episode will be in Portuguese, but with live subtitles online on Facebook and options to view it afterwards with subtitles. And we'll be sharing a notice to everyone who's registered at wit.to/deepfakery. Please register there if you haven't, about a special edition later this month focused on manipulated media in the US elections. Thanks, everyone.